A 75-year-old woman, dismissed as fragile and irrelevant by a group of bikers, silences them with a chilling revelation from her past, proving that age and appearance can never define a person's true strength. These are stories I have witnessed with the names of those involved changed to protect their identities. I don't want to tell them like cold news reports, but as real fragments of life that carry simple yet profound lessons. Never underestimate anyone because of the color of their skin. Before we begin, tell me, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you watching from? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your story. Clara Thomas was a woman of 75, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet dignity that made her seem both older and younger than her years. Living in a small, quiet town in Alabama, she had long since become a fixture in the community. Though few people really knew her beyond the surface, she was a woman of routine, a person who didn't need to impress anyone with flashy appearances or grand gestures. On this particular Wednesday afternoon, Clara stepped out of the Davis Grocery, a small corner store that had been around for decades. The sun beat down fiercely on the town, and the heat was nearly unbearable. Clara's body, worn down by years of life and struggle, reminded her of its age with every step she took. Her hips ached from arthritis, a constant reminder of the decades she had lived. She wasn't in a hurry. The world around her moved fast. But Clara had learned the art of patience over her many years. She was dressed simply. As always, a faded blue house dress that hung loosely on her frail body, sturdy orthopedic shoes, and a wide-brimmed straw hat that shielded her face from the harsh sunlight. Her walker, an essential tool that had accompanied her for years, had tennis balls on its back legs, its rubber soles worn smooth from constant use. There was nothing special about Clara's appearance, but that was exactly how she liked it. She didn't need the latest fashions or designer accessories. All she wanted was peace and simplicity. Her quiet little home with its overgrown garden, her front porch where she spent hours tending to her rose bushes, and her small circle of friends at church. This was all Clara needed to feel content. As she walked away from the store, clutching her bag with a bottle of peach sweet tea and a pack of sugar-free mints, she was focused only on getting back to her porch and the solitude she cherished. But the moment she stepped out into the parking lot, her routine would be disrupted in a way she never expected. And it would be a disruption that would force everyone around her to reconsider the value of age, the power of silence, and the depths of a seemingly ordinary woman. As Clara continued her slow, steady walk across the parking lot, the oppressive heat of the Alabama afternoon seemed to weigh even heavier on her frail body. The rhythmic sound of her walker's tennis balls scraping against the asphalt was the only noise that broke the silence of the small town. Her mind wandered back to the simpler times, to the days when life seemed more predictable, when the biggest decisions she had to make were whether to plant tulips or roses in the garden, or which Sunday roast recipe to follow. But as she neared the street corner, her peaceful world was disrupted. Clara had seen the motorcycles before she even reached the lot, their gleaming chrome and rumbling engines unmistakable as they sat idling in front of the store. She wasn't bothered by them at first. She had seen bikers in the past, most of them harmless enough, passing through or stopping for gas. But there was something about the trio of men leaning against their bikes that unsettled her. They wore the colors of the Steel Iron MC, a local outlaw motorcycle club that had a reputation for causing trouble. Clara wasn't intimidated by them. After all, she had lived a life filled with far more dangerous individuals, people who had seen far worse than a few tattoos and leather vests. The bikers didn't seem to notice her as she moved past them, though they were watching, their eyes following her every move. One of them, a tall man with a deep, gravelly voice, broke the silence with a loud laugh. "Look at that old fossil," he sneered, his words echoing off the walls of the grocery store. "Where's the museum tag, Granny?" His laughter was followed by the mocking chuckles of his companions. Clara didn't flinch. She had heard worse over the years, both on and off the battlefield. But the words were unnecessary, cutting through the heat and the silence like a knife. The laughter continued as one of the other bikers took a step forward, leaning over the back of his motorcycle and coughing dramatically, mimicking the sound of Clara's walker scraping the ground. Must have fought in the Civil War, another one added, his voice dripping with mockery. Or was it the dinosaurs that got her? The group howled with laughter, enjoying their cruel game, but Clara remained calm, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her back straight as she continued her walk, unfazed by the insults thrown her way. She had fought battles much tougher than this, but the jokes didn't stop. The leader of the group, a burly man covered in tattoos, took a long drag from his cigarette and eyed Clara as if she were some kind of museum piece. She's a relic, he said, his voice almost a growl, straight out of black and white TV. Clara didn't stop walking, but she didn't let his words go unnoticed. She had lived through more than he could ever imagine, and if he thought he could mock her without consequence, he had another thing coming. She continued moving forward, but something inside her shifted. The anger she had learned to suppress over the years began to stir, and a voice deep within her urged her to stand up not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, ignored, or dismissed because of their age or appearance. As she reached the sidewalk in front of the store, she stopped, her hands, which had been clutching the plastic bag with the tea and mints, now hung loosely by her sides. She didn't turn around. Instead, she adjusted her bag, and with a slow, deliberate movement, she turned her head just slightly toward the bikers. Her voice, calm and steady, cut through the tension like a blade. "Excuse me." "Bah," she said, her tone unwavering. "What did you call me?" The laughter from the group abruptly stopped. For a brief moment, the air around them seemed to hold its breath. The leader, who had been the loudest, smirked, clearly expecting Clara to shrink in fear. "I said," he sneered, stepping closer, "you're a relic. Grandma, time's passed you by." The words hung in the air, but Clara didn't back down. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering, not because she was fearless, but because she had learned that in moments like these, it wasn't fear that mattered. It was the ability to stand firm, to not let others define your worth. The bikers waited for her to react, to show anger or fear, but Clara simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes locking onto the leaders with a knowing look. "See, here's the thing you don't understand," she began, her voice soft but strong. "You think you know everything, but I've lived long enough to see men like you come and go. And let me tell you, most of them don't age well." The words landed like a punch to the gut. But Clara wasn't done yet. She didn't wait for them to respond, didn't allow them the pleasure of seeing her riled up. Instead, she continued walking, her steps slow but purposeful, her gaze fixed ahead, a quiet defiance in her every movement. She wasn't just a relic. She was someone who had seen far more than these bikers could ever imagine. And as she passed them, the mood in the air shifted, the laughter died down, and the tension began to build. Clara knew she wasn't just walking away from these men. She was walking into something much bigger. Clara continued to walk, her pace steady. But something in the air had changed. The heat of the afternoon seemed to press down even harder now, thick with the kind of tension that makes every breath feel heavier. The bikers were quiet, their mockery silenced by her calm, unwavering response. Clara had turned her back to them, but she could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their gazes pressing against her like a physical force. She could almost hear the thoughts running through their minds. Who was this old woman? Why hadn't she reacted the way they expected? Most people would have snapped back with a sharp retort, or at least shown some sign of irritation. But Clara was not most people. She was not just an old woman who had reached the age where time seemed to have passed her by. She had lived through more than they could ever comprehend. As she reached the corner of the parking lot, she heard the sound of one of the bikers stepping forward, the leader, Brock. his boots clicking on the concrete as he approached her. Clara didn't turn around, but she knew he was there. She didn't need to see him to know that he had something else to say, something more to prove. "Hey, lady." Brock's voice was low now, his earlier bravado replaced with a hint of uncertainty. "You think you know who I am?" Clara stopped in her tracks. She didn't look back, but she felt the shift in the air, the subtle way the world seemed to pause, just for a second. As if holding its breath, Brock took another step closer, his shadow stretching over her as he tried to read her reaction. But Clara remained still, her hands resting by her sides, her gaze focused on the ground ahead. She had known people like Brock her entire life, bullies, show-offs, men who thought that strength came from making others feel small. But Clara knew better. She had spent decades in places where true power wasn't about size or noise. It was about knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. "I don't care what you think you know about me," Brock said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "You don't know anything." Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, letting him stew in it. She knew that he wanted her to crack, to show that he had gotten under her skin. But Clara was unshaken. Her silence was more powerful than any words she could have said. After a long moment, she turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her face. The air between them seemed to thicken, as if something unspoken was hanging in the balance. Then, with a calmness that sent a chill through Brock, Clara spoke. "You think you're the only one who's got secrets." Brock. Her voice was quiet, but there was a steel edge to it that cut through the tension. "You think you're the only one who's had things to hide." The words hit harder than any insult, and for a moment, Brock froze. His eyes flickered with something recognition, fear, uncertainty. But before he could respond, Clara took a slow, deliberate step forward. "I know your name," she said, her tone still calm, but carrying a weight that made Brock stiffen. "And I know the name you used before that. I know the things you've done, the things you've tried to bury. You can hide behind tattoos, behind leather jackets, behind your gang, but the truth is, it's still there, and I remember." The group of bikers fell silent. The only sound was the low hum of the motorcycles idling. But even that seemed distant, as if the world had narrowed down to the two of them standing in the middle of the parking lot. Brock swallowed hard, his earlier cocky demeanor slipping away as his mind raced. Clara wasn't just some old woman. She wasn't even just a woman who had lived through things he couldn't begin to imagine. She was someone who had seen and remembered everything. Someone who knew things he had long hoped would stay buried. "What the hell do you want?" Brock finally managed to croak, his voice strained with the beginnings of fear. Clara didn't answer right away. She just let the question hang in the air, let him stew in his own uncertainty. She didn't need to threaten him. The truth was enough. "I don't want anything from you," she said finally. "I'm just reminding you that the past doesn't stay buried forever. It doesn't matter how far you run. Sooner or later, it comes back." Clara paused, her eyes locking onto Brock's, and for the first time, he seemed to falter. His eyes darted from side to side, looking for an escape, a way to regain control, but the power had shifted, and he knew it. "You don't know what you're messing with," Brock muttered, but his words lacked the conviction they had earlier. Clara tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need to know everything, Brock. I just need to know the truth." She took another step forward, her presence a silent challenge. "And the truth always comes out in the end." The air around them seemed to tighten, and Brock stepped back, just an inch. But it was enough. The bikers who had been watching the scene unfold now looked at each other nervously. They could feel the shift in power, the uncomfortable weight of Clara's words. And for the first time, the biker gang wasn't the intimidating presence they had once been. It was Clara who had the upper hand, the woman they had mocked, The relic they had belittled was now the one standing tall, and they realized, too late, that she was not someone to be underestimated. The shift in the air was palpable as Clara stood there, unwavering, facing Brock and the other bikers. The tension had shifted, and it was no longer a game for them. Clara's calm demeanor, her confidence, and her steady gaze had disarmed them in ways they couldn't understand. They had expected a confrontation, a reaction that would fit the image of an old woman, fragile and weak, someone who would crumble under pressure. But they were wrong. Clara was no ordinary woman. As Brock stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, he began to feel the weight of the situation settle on him, like a heavy cloak. The laughter from his gang had long since stopped, replaced by uneasy silence. His crew, the men who had followed him in every reckless endeavor, now looked at him with uncertainty in their eyes. It was as if Clara had peeled back the layers of bravado that Brock had hidden behind for years, revealing him as something far smaller than he had ever allowed anyone to see. He wasn't a leader anymore. He was just a man, standing before a woman who had seen through his facade. The irony hit him hard. He had spent years intimidating others, using his size and his gang to instill fear. But now, in front of this elderly woman, he felt small and vulnerable. Clara could see the crack in his armor. She didn't need to say more. Everything was unfolding before her eyes. It was a moment of truth, not just for Brock, but for everyone who had underestimated her. She could see it in the way his shoulders had slumped, in the way his eyes darted around for an escape, a way to salvage what little dignity he had left. The bikers, who had been so ready to mock her, now looked like they were waiting for the storm to pass, unsure of what to do next. And it wasn't fear of Clara herself that had them paralyzed. It was the realization that the truth, the very truth they had tried to bury, had been brought to light. Clara didn't need to shout or raise her voice. She didn't need to confront them with accusations or threats. Her words, her calm assertion, were enough to expose them. They were the ones who had misjudged her, and now they were trapped in a quiet storm of their own making. "You're not the only one with secrets, Brock," Clara said again, her voice steady and low, but carrying the weight of 100 unspoken truths. "And you won't be the last one who thinks they can bury the past and walk away. But the past always comes back, even for people like you." The silence stretched out again, thick and heavy, as the gang leader's face slowly drained of color. There was no fight left in him now, no defiance. He was just a man who had been caught in his own lies, standing before a woman who had outlived and outsmarted him. Clara didn't need to press him further. The moment was already his defeat. She had done what no one else could do. She had stood her ground, faced the threat, and made him realize that not all power came from physical strength or intimidation. Sometimes, true power was quiet, unwavering, and unafraid to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As the tension simmered, Clara took one last look at the group, letting the silence sink in. Without another word, she turned, slowly resuming her walk toward the corner of the street, her back straight and her pace unbroken. The bikers stood frozen, watching her go, each of them reflecting on the lesson they had just learned. It wasn't a lesson about strength or power. It was a lesson about respect and the hidden depths of a person's character, something they had overlooked in their rush to mock her. And for the first time in a long time, they understood what it meant to underestimate someone and the consequences that came with it. Clara had already won, and she didn't need to say a word to make that clear. Clara's footsteps echoed softly as she continued walking, leaving the group of bikers behind. Still standing, motionless in the parking lot, the silence hung thick in the air, and the once confident gang was now left to grapple with a quiet unease. As she moved further away, Clara could hear the faint murmurs behind her. But she didn't turn back. She knew that what had just transpired wasn't about a confrontation. It was about something deeper, something that would stay with them long after the moment had passed. The power in that moment wasn't in her words alone. It was in the sheer presence of someone who had lived through it all and could stand unshaken. While others around her crumbled under the weight of their own guilt, Clara didn't need to speak any louder, didn't need to press them further. She had already delivered the message. The truth had already found its place. And it wasn't going anywhere. She walked toward the street corner, her pace unhurried, each step deliberate. Clara was used to moving through the world without drawing attention. But today had been different. Today, she had reminded those around her of something important, the truth. No matter how long it had been buried, had a way of resurfacing when least expected. She knew this truth better than anyone. She had spent her life in intelligence, gathering secrets, uncovering hidden stories, and dealing with things that most people would never even imagine. She had seen what men like Brock tried to hide, and she knew that their bravado, their deflection, was just a mask. But Clara wasn't interested in revenge. She didn't need to tear them down to feel powerful. She had already lived a life that most people would never understand. What mattered now was that they had learned to stop underestimating her. Clara's strength had never come from physical might or loud commands. It had always been in her ability to remain calm, to observe, to wait for the right moment to reveal the truth. And today, that truth had been laid bare, not with force, but with quiet certainty. The bikers, who had once mocked her, now had no choice but to respect her. They didn't know what she knew or where she had been, but they knew one thing for certain: Clara Thomas was not someone to be taken lightly. As she reached the corner, she turned her head briefly, catching sight of the small crowd that had gathered across the street. Some of them were watching from their cars. Others stood outside the store, quietly observing what had just happened. No one had cheered for Clara. No one had clapped. But she didn't need that. The respect was already there, unspoken, but clear in the way the crowd lingered, the way they regarded her with newfound recognition. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt the weight of their gaze, but it didn't make her uncomfortable. She wasn't interested in fame or applause. What mattered was that her actions had made an impact. She had shown them, without a single word of aggression, that true power wasn't about making others fear you. It was about making others see you, truly see you, for who you were: someone who had lived, who had survived, and who wasn't afraid to stand up when it mattered. Clara's walk didn't change. She wasn't in a rush to get anywhere, and she didn't look back at the group of bikers or the onlookers. She simply kept walking, her path steady and her mind calm. As she reached her house, she took a deep breath, stepping onto her porch, the familiar creak of the screen door welcoming her back. There was no need for triumph or celebration. Clara didn't need anyone else to recognize her victory. She had already won, not in the way that most people would have imagined, but in the quiet dignity of standing her ground when everyone else expected her to fade away. Today, she had reminded them of the power of patience, of the truth that always rises to the surface, and of the strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Clara sat down on her porch, folding the walker beside her and settling into the worn-out chair that had seen more years than any of the furniture inside her house. The warmth of the sun had begun to fade, replaced by the cool, calming evening breeze that swept through the trees in her garden. Her eyes scanned the familiar sight of her rose bushes, the simple, peaceful view that had always been her sanctuary. But today, that quiet had been shattered. Today, the past had come rushing back to her in ways she hadn't expected. She had always known that her life was full of secrets, things she kept hidden not because she was ashamed, but because some truths were better left undisturbed. But today, it was as if the universe had decided to throw those secrets right into the open as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Clara couldn't help but reflect on the way things had unfolded with Brock and his gang. She had lived a full life, seen more than most. But what had happened in that parking lot wasn't just about standing up to a group of bullies. It was about reclaiming the power that people often assumed was lost with age. It was about proving that no matter how quiet you are, no matter how much time has passed, Your voice still matters. Clara had spent years in the intelligence field, a world where power was often silent, hidden beneath layers of strategy and calculation. She had learned how to read people, how to assess situations, and how to wait for the perfect moment to act. And when Brock and his crew had mocked her, she had known exactly what to do. It wasn't about reacting emotionally or getting angry. It was about taking control of the situation, about letting them see that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. What Clara hadn't expected, though, was how much that small moment would impact her. She hadn't realized that it wasn't just the bikers who had been forced to reckon with the past. It was the entire town, the people who had watched from across the street, the ones who had stood by and done nothing, were now questioning their own assumptions. They had all seen Clara as the quiet old woman, the one who sat on her porch, who tended to her roses and smiled politely at everyone. But they hadn't seen her for who she really was, a woman who had lived through things they couldn't even imagine, a woman who had faced danger and adversity and had come out the other side, unbroken. The realization hit Clara slowly, but as she sat there, watching the fading light of the day, she began to understand that her power wasn't just in what she had done in the past. It was in the way she had carried herself through the years. It was in her ability to endure, to keep going even when the world around her seemed to forget her. Today had been a turning point, not just for the bikers, but for the whole town. Clara had reminded them all that no one's story is ever over, that the past can resurface at any moment, and that strength is not defined by how loud you shout, but by how firmly you stand when the storm comes. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She had already done it. She had shown that even the quietest voices could change the course of things. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Clara leaned back in her chair, content, knowing that the truth had found its way out, and that it would continue to echo long after the day had ended. As Clara sat in her chair, the evening grew quieter, the world around her settling into a peaceful rhythm. The events of the afternoon replayed in her mind, but there was no sense of triumph in her thoughts, only a quiet satisfaction. She had done what needed to be done, not for recognition or praise, but because it was the right thing. The moment in the parking lot had passed, but its echoes reverberated through the town in ways she hadn't anticipated. The bikers, who had once mocked her, were now scattered like leaves in the wind, their bravado stripped away by the weight of truth. Clara knew they would never forget her, not for the reasons they had once assumed. They would remember her not as the frail old woman they had laughed at, but as someone who had stood her ground and reminded them that there was always more beneath the surface than they could see. But it wasn't just Brock and his gang that Clara had impacted. It was everyone who had witnessed the moment, the people who had gathered across the street, watching as the scene unfolded, now looked at her differently. The store clerks who had watched her every day, the neighbors who waved at her from their porches, the people who thought they knew her, they all saw her in a new light. Clara had been a fixture in their lives, but she had never truly been seen. Today, she had made them see her, and more importantly, she had made them see themselves. It wasn't just about the bikers. It was about the way people tend to overlook the elderly, the way society writes them off as irrelevant, as if their voices no longer matter. Clara had reminded everyone that aging didn't mean fading away. She had shown them that strength didn't come from youth or physical prowess. It came from wisdom, experience, and the quiet determination to live life on your own terms. As the town processed the events of the day, whispers spread like wildfire. Some said Clara had been a hero. Others just marveled at the sheer audacity of it all. But Clara didn't need the titles. She didn't need to be seen as a hero, a symbol, or anything else. What mattered to her was that she had done what she set out to do, to be heard, to make a statement, and to show the world that no one, no matter their age, should ever be underestimated. Later that evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Clara smiled softly to herself. It wasn't a smile of pride, but a quiet, knowing smile. She knew that the lesson had been learned, not just by the bikers or the onlookers, but by herself as well. In the end, the truth had a way of making its presence known. It didn't need to be forced or shouted. It simply had to be allowed to surface. And when it did, it had the power to change everything. For Clara, today wasn't about proving anything. It was about reminding the world that strength wasn't defined by what you had done in the past. It was defined by how you carried yourself in the present, by how you stood up when the time came. And as she sat in the quiet of her porch, watching the stars above, Clara knew that she had done just that. She had stood firm, and in doing so, she had set a new course, not just for herself, but for everyone who had witnessed her quiet moment of strength. The world, for a brief moment, had seen her for who she truly was, and that, Clara knew, was enough. As Clara sat on her porch, the night stretched on, and the stars above seemed to twinkle a little brighter. The events of the day had unfolded in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. But as the hours passed, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had not set out to be a hero or to make a statement for anyone other than herself. But sometimes, the truth has a way of finding its voice when you least expect it. Today, she had reminded everyone Brock, his gang, and the town that age was not a measure of one's strength. She had shown them that a quiet, unassuming life could still hold power, and that the past, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of resurfacing when the time was right. Clara's life had been filled with moments of hardship, sacrifice, and secrets. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that she had lived, she had endured, and she had always found a way to keep going. The lesson she had taught, both to herself and to others, was simple. True strength comes from within, and no one, no matter their age, should ever be underestimated. With that thought, Clara took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and allowed the quiet of the night to embrace her content, knowing she had done exactly what she had needed to do. Thank you so much for watching the entire video. We truly appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed the content, please make sure to leave a comment below. Let us know your thoughts or share any questions you might have. Don't forget to hit the like button if you found the video helpful. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing content like this. Your feedback and engagement mean the world to us. And subscribing will help you stay updated with all our future videos. Thanks again. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one.